Hello, so I wanted to record a quick video showcasing the new thing that I've been working on. Lately I haven't had much time, so it's a very simple thing. Basically, I finally got around to implementing the complex collision system. So as you can see, I can collide with these crates and these barrels right here, right? These crates in here as well. And these boxes right here are still debug objects which have no collision, and that's an important detail, right? And if we go over to these walls right here, you will see that the collision is actually larger than the walls themselves, right? So let me showcase why things are the way that they are. Basically, if we go over to the level editor, it's actually just Blender, but you get what I mean. If we select any object, we have this option right here that determines what kind of object it will be, and we can say that we want this object to be geometry, collision, water, lava. You get the deal, right? And when we generate it, if we pick any object created, by default it's going to be a geometry object, which means that it's going to be the object that's going to be visible in level, right? And we have this option that says use complex collision. Use complex collision refers to the idea that the collision, like the polygons of the visual mesh itself, are going to be used for the collision mesh as well, right? So it basically extracts the data of the polygons of this mesh and uses them directly for the collision mesh, rather than generating a simplified collision mesh, right? So this can be okay for simple shapes or for terrains or stuff like that, right? So crates, boxes, houses, etc. They can pretty much use complex collision because it's pretty cheap and it doesn't matter, right? But if you got an object like a tree or something with a high level of detail with lots of polygons, it might get too expensive to compute the collisions. So it would eventually be better to make it have no collision and select it to have a custom collision mesh made by hand, right? So if we go over here, we can see that we have the option for collision, and the collision mesh actually doesn't have any use complex collision because basically it will do the same. It will take the polygons of this mesh and use them for the collision, but this time you're gonna be modeling an object which is going to be a collision mesh, right? So basically that means that you won't be able to see this object. Its polygons won't be used for any visual reasons. It's only going to exist for creating collision mesh, which you will be generating by hand. There is no automatic complex collision generation or anything fancy like that. So if you want the lower polygon detail collision mesh, you're gonna make it by hand. And another detail that you may have noticed is the collision layer option, right? Which disappears if we disable complex collision. And in collision it's always visible because pretty much there's no way to disable collision. If you're gonna make an object collision, it doesn't make sense to say I don't want this to have collision, right? Because then it wouldn't be used for anything. So basically, what is this option right here? This option for collision layer basically tells the compiler, or rather not the compiler, but better the exporter, in what layer it has to put it, right? And there are layers 0 through 9. Now, still we're not too sure what collision layers really are for, but within the game code of Magicka, there are 10 quote-unquote layers of collision in which you can put collision meshes, right? The map reader reads in a loop 10 times the collision meshes, which means that you can have like 10 layers. So I guess they are used for special collision cases or whatever. But you can have everything in layer 0 and it will work just fine. That's pretty much what a lot of levels do actually in the official game. They have all collisions within collision layer 0. So pretty much you can have 9 different layers if you want, but you can put everything in 0 and it will be 100% okay. So apart from that, let me showcase the collision mesh that we have. So the reason why I said that it was relevant before, that we were colliding with this wall but not exactly with it, with something bigger than that is because we have a collision mesh in here, right? Which is one of the things that I showcased first in this video series. So these objects, as you can see, they don't have a collision mesh or anything like that. They are going to be using their own geometry to generate the collision, right? So basically in this example, the collision mesh is basically outdated because it exists primarily, well, the trees don't exist anymore, so their collision mesh is basically blocking the air, and the houses don't need a collision mesh because they are actually very simple low poly meshes. So it's a simpler collision mesh, but it doesn't really make much of a performance gain. It only makes it harder to model the level, right? So as you can see, things like these walls right here, which I used to manually have to add a collision mesh for, we can pretty much just get rid of, and the floor as well. We can just select them all and get rid of them and delete them because we don't need a collision mesh for them anymore. It's now such a simple shape that it will automatically generate them without any trouble, right? It's basically the exact same. We before had a copy of this mesh to make the collision, and now, since I think it's a simple enough mesh, I just decide to allow it to use complex collision and say, hey, generate this mesh out of your own geometry. The houses, we could do the same, but for now I'm gonna keep it because it's still simpler to have the collision mesh that I made than the one of the geometry of the levels itself. And the walls, I'm gonna leave them as some example because in here you see that there's some gaps in between that you can get stuck on when walking, right? And this is one of those good examples of where you would usually in a real level, usually in game development, just put a blocking volume to manually mark where you don't want people to be able to get out of the map, right? And you can even go as far as selecting this wall and increasing the walls infinitely because it's an invisible collision volume, right? So you can just do that if you want to make it impossible to get out of a certain section of the map, right? But we're gonna keep it like that because we only want the wall to be smooth to traverse. And obviously I'm gonna get rid of this collision mesh in here because there's no longer a tree. But to drive my point home, I'm going to actually go ahead and place in here a mesh that has a somewhat complex level of collision. So we got the whole sapling tree gen from Blender, right? We can just place a tree in here, and if we go over to layout to see things a little bit nicer, we don't really have to add any leaves or anything like that. We can just pick the tree, right? And we go over to the inspector right here. We can see that it's pretty much a curve, so we can convert to mesh. We made it into a mesh, right? And here it is. It's just a mesh now. And this mesh, as you can see, has a really high level of detail compared to the rest of the scene. It's a pretty low poly tree actually, right? But Magicka only has complex collisions. It doesn't have anything like bounding boxes or simpler convex collisions, right? Every single collision in Magicka is a collision mesh generated triangle by triangle. So that means that it's going to actually be pretty expensive to simulate anything. So if we make ourselves this tree kind of bigger or whatever, we can place it whatever we want. For example, we say, I don't know, I want the tree to be in here or something. I don't care, right? We can have a tree in here. And this previous collision mesh that we had before we could actually reuse, but I'm gonna delete it and just showcase from the ground up how it's made. So we have this collision mesh right here, which I painted in red, which is all merged because of the way that things work in the early versions of the exporter. We can actually just make another mesh in here and mark it as collision, and that's it. You don't need this to be like that. And the material I'm going to select only for visual purposes. You don't need any materials for this, right? So now we got ourselves the tree. We can just say, okay, I want this to have its own collision, something like that. We're gonna move it up. We're gonna make it a little bit bigger, etc. Right? And basically there comes a point where you just cover it like that. And some of this stuff around here, you might not care the player clipping through them, right? Like, that's one of the great things about making your collision meshes by hand, that there's parts that you may not care about the player clipping through them. For example, some leaves, some plants, some branches, whatever, right? There's like a certain degree of control that you get, right? So I'm gonna rename this to collision, and I'm going to put underscores to bring it to the top, right? Like this is no longer needed. Before we needed to put underscore collision to mark it as a collision mesh. This is not necessary anymore. This is now a naming convention that you can pick up if you want for the sake of organizing your meshes in the sim, right? And if we make it invisible, this is the tree that we got. We can make it visible again. And if you want a higher degree of precision, because you know you might not want this to be a boxy mesh, you might want this to be more circular, you can bevel this, or if you don't like beveling it, you can just make like 2 cuts in here and bring those outward, right? Like you could do something like this, for example, and or I don't know, whatever you want, right? You can do something like this and something like this, for example, and maybe make the collision mesh a little bit smaller or thinner or whatever. You just adjust it as much as you think you need to be able to get the result that you desire. And I think this is like good enough for the most part, right? Like pretty much for all intents and purposes, this is just the best we're gonna get out of this, right? Like the most I really need to get out of this collision mesh. And we got it. This is like a far simpler shape than the one that we had just a while ago. So we can go over and say export this as a JSON file here. We export it, and if I go over to here and open up my collision output, let me check. We got it in here. Okay, and we can take it to C, test files, replace it. I'm going to open up here and just compile it, right? And there we go. And that took quite a while because of the tree, but also the printing. If we disable printing, which I'll be making an option, we can just make it far faster because it doesn't have to flash data to a standard output. We can just replace the level, and we go outside and we start, and let's see if it worked. And here we go. We got the tree, which is painted in green because I didn't assign any texture to it, but as you can see, it's got a collision, right? Which is actually the simpler collision mesh that I gave to it, right? It's not anything other. Whoops. Yeah, as you can see, it's a little bit bigger than the tree itself, so clearly it's the collision mesh that I made, and that's pretty much what I wanted to achieve. And this box that I remove its collision mesh has it because I set it to be a complex collision object. And this object right here, they have their collision disabled, and they have the complex collision mesh around them so that it's a smooth wall even though they are not completely straight aligned. So, you know, visually we get the noise that we want to get where the walls are not perfectly aligned for eye candy, but physically we slide through the wall. So for gameplay reasons, this is perfect because the player won't be getting stuck on the wall, right? So pretty much that's all that I wanted to showcase, and it's pretty much all there is to my progress for today. I will be trying to do more stuff when I get time, but yeah, thanks for watching.